today to welcome artist Riks van Glintenkamp. He's going to talk to us about his exhibition, Echoes in the Ice. Before I have Riks speak, I would like to thank very much my students from the Museum Studies class who worked very hard to put up this exhibition. It took us just 1 week to take down the previous show and put up this new exhibit. So I wanted to thank them, and I wanted to thank Pat Vine and Jackie and Arisa who helped us here in the art gallery. So thank you so much. Artist Riks van Glintenkamp has been fascinated with the Arctic since he was very, very young. And after a very successful career as a photographer and filmmaker, he was able to devote himself to creating these collages that feature Arctic and Antarctic explorers from the very beginning, the 1500s until 1900s. He's going to tell us about his process in creating these collages, and we're very honored to have him here today. Thank you so much.
I don't know about you, but throughout my life, I've had people enter my life that I call dream facilitators. They do something, they say something, they somehow nudge me in the right direction or give me a way to go or work with my work or a compliment or a shove in the right way. I always feel, on behalf of myself and on behalf of the explorers that are covered here, these explorers went to the Arctic and the Antarctic. I feel that I have to thank people, and I want to thank Alessandra, and I want to thank Pat, and apparently from what I've been told, there were a whole lot of other people here and not here who helped in the arranging and the hanging of the show, and I want to thank all of you, whoever you are, and you know who you are. It was a magnificent job. The show has been in many locations, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, Harvard University, to mention only a few. And these people have all moved the ball forward, helped to facilitate the dream, but about the nicest has been Mesa College, in the layout and the design, in the look of it, in the selection and the arrangement of the collages. These collages, as I said, are about the Arctic and the Antarctic. I'm going to select about 4 or 5 of them. Those of you who want to come up closer, it's more of a gallery talk than me standing here. The show is based on several things. The internet, from which I glean information, and if I'm interested in the information, I can expand it and find associative connections to it. If I want to get a book on a particular explorer, I can get it in a big hurry from eBay or from Amazon. And finally, the Xerox process, which I've used in connection, I've worked with Xerox. They have sponsored this show in many different ways. And all of these things are reproduced. There's information in them. For example, here's a booklet that Admiral Byrne published with an oil company. I couldn't rip that book up and put it in here. I own the book, but it has value to it. And the fidelity that I can create through Xerox copying is part of what has not been developed except in the past few years. The Antarctic is told through the history of these explorers. The Arctic the same. The Arctic was of interest because since the 1400s they've been searching for a way to go from Europe over the northern territories and down into China. But nobody ever went there to live. There are some Inuit Indians who are local people who live there, but nobody went there to to Antarctica to escape religious persecution. These are barren and threatening and remote places. And it takes a certain amount of heroism to undertake such a voyage. Admiral Byrd has been to both poles. He is not on the ground, he's a flyer. And he conquered the North Pole, which is now being contested, and he conquered the South Pole, which is not being contested. When I was a little kid, about 7 years old, I wrote to Admiral Byrd. He had had 5 expeditions to Antarctica, and I had heard about it and I wanted to go. So I wrote him a letter, and I sent him some drawings of mine. And I asked him if it was possible for me to go with him on his next Antarctic voyage. I didn't hear from him for a long time, and finally he wrote back, and he said he was sorry that the tour was all booked up, and they were changing to photographs. They weren't doing drawings anymore. And he said perhaps maybe on a future voyage. Well, you know what that meant. I think that germ of that idea of going with him played an important part as to the happening of this exposition. My second picture is over here. This man is an American. His name is Lincoln Ellsworth. He was a good friend of Admiral Byrd. Admiral Byrd loved playing the role of the hero. He admitted it. He said that he was more interested in being a hero than ever going to the North Pole or the South Pole. Lincoln Ellsworth was in a unique position. It's kind of like show business. Most of these explorers, when they want to take an expedition to the Arctic or the Antarctic, they have to go out and raise the money themselves. Sometimes they are backed by governments, but a lot of the times they have to raise the money themselves. Lincoln Ellsworth was very, very rich, never had to work a day in his life, and could set out and finance an expedition or an exploration anytime he wanted to. His father, James, I'm pointing this out because this collage has sort of the seeds of a lot of the others, and you can see them very blatantly. I've included his father, James, over here, and he was, as I say, extremely rich, Pittsburgh steel. He was so rich that one weekend he flew off and went to Europe and purchased a Rembrandt. He also purchased a castle and the castle had 100 clocks in it, all of which ticked at the same time and all of which went off at the same time. Lincoln Ellsworth, like most of these explorers, had another side to him. They had determination, but they're also quite kooky. Here is a picture of the Tsarina of Russia. Lincoln Ellsworth was madly in love with the Tsarina of Russia. This is in the 20s. Except there was one thing that was wrong with their relationship. They never met. It was all in his mind. The same thing could be said over here as an elderly gentleman getting married. This is Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was Lincoln Ellsworth's hero. His ship that brought him to Antarctica, on which they carried an airplane. The ship was called the Wyatt Earp. The crew was recruited from Norway, and he had those people who could speak English and Norwegian read Wyatt Earp's biography to the Norwegian sailors who frankly didn't care very much or weren't that interested. He also took Wyatt Earp's gun belt and Wyatt Earp's wedding ring, which was given to him by Wyatt Earp's widow. He took those to the Antarctic as well. The reason that I show you these elements, or it's easy to show you these elements, is I'm assuming that most of you are art students or connected with it. This is a collage, but these are collages of a different type. I think many people have done collage, but these are more restricted. It isn't that I thought that this looked nice against the American flag. It was a reason for that. The elements in the collage belong to the explorer himself and belong in a larger scale to Arctic and Antarctic exploration. One of the most interesting pictures, which will give you another idea about the exploration to the Arctic and the Antarctic, is this little picture right here of this man sitting in the snow on some supplies. The man's name is Halleck Kenyon. Halleck Kenyon was the pilot of the airplane. The explorer themselves, when they went to search the Arctic and the Antarctic, didn't generally captain the ship or pilot the plane. They were more the sponsor and the launcher of the whole activity and the brains behind it. So Halleck Kenyon was the pilot and Lincoln Ellsworth was the owner of the airplane. The reason this little picture is so important is, keep in mind, Antarctica, this frozen wasteland, which we're now concerned about is going to melt. Antarctica is as big as the United States of America and Mexico put together. It's a vast wasteland. The boat that was on the way to pick them up, they had just flown across Antarctica and were the first people to do so. The boat that was coming to pick them up, the Wyatt Earp, had not touched down, had not landed in Antarctica. Halleck Kenyon and Wyatt Earp and Lincoln Ellsworth were alone on a continent by themselves. A continent that's bigger than the United States and Mexico put together. The more you think about it, the more astounding these places become. This is a collage about a French explorer to Antarctica and made a round-the-world voyage in the 1840s, and he's French. A little bit more about my background. I graduated Syracuse University, and from there I was born and brought up in New York City from Syracuse University, where I too was an art major. I went back to live in New York, and I became a very successful still photographer. I worked for Glamour. I worked mostly in fashion and beauty. I worked for Glamour. I worked for Cosmopolitan. I worked for Elle magazine. And this was a major part of my career. From there, I went on to, it was a natural segue into film and video. And I produced a number of films for public television. What I did was, when I was producing films, you've heard of storyboarding like Steven Spielberg does. I had developed a system called bulletin boarding, where I would take important little things like, oh, we have to cast a fat man. Well, he should look like this, and I'd pin it up on the wall. Or he should wear spats, and I'd pick a picture of spats and I'd put it up on the wall so that the stylists and production people would know what they were looking for and how to put the thing together visually. At one point during my career in filmmaking, someone handed me a book. The book was called The Diary of Edward Wilson's Trip with Captain Scott. It was his personal diary to his wife. And it was very beautifully written, very, with great warmth, great caring. And I was very, very moved by this book. And I started to get into not only Edward Wilson, who doesn't appear here, but other Antarctic explorers. And lo and behold, I started getting this idea of doing a series of films on them for public television. And so I and people who were working with me went out and we started to bulletin board what this would look like, what that would look like, which one of Wilson's pictures would you include in this. Well, the series was not accepted by public television. I had a tough time, and I never got it produced. But you can imagine, with all of this information pinned up, it's not a big step from there to a collage. And that's basically how I got into it. I do certain things that are cinematic. Dumont d'Urville discovered a large section of Antarctica, and he also found a cast of penguins, and he nicknamed them after his wife. The place is called Adeliland, and it still exists today, and the penguins still exist today, and they're called Adelie penguins. I went crazy trying to find a picture of Mrs. Dumont d'Urville. I couldn't find a picture of her. Finally, I said to myself, well, Peter O'Toole plays Lawrence of Arabia. They're not even the same in size. Why don't I cast somebody that I think looks like Mrs. Dumont d'Urville? So don't be fooled. This is a picture taken by a photographer, but I felt she must be a very, very attractive woman, because who would name a whole cast of penguins, and who would name a huge part of Antarctica unless you were pretty impressed with this lady? He also, by the way, discovered the Venus de Milo, which is in the Louvre, in a prior voyage, and he got the French government to purchase the statue from one of his many voyages. He came to a rather tragic end after he came back from Antarctica. He went with his wife Adelie and their young son to Versailles for a picnic, and on the way back, he was in a train wreck and all three of them were burned to death. This is after suffering much in Antarctica. There's another, if you're looking, there's another picture, another collage, just around the corner. It's of a man named Nathaniel Bowditch, and he was the same way. I came across this picture of the eyes of a poet, and I used that picture as his eyes. Obviously, he lived in the 1700s. It would be rare that you'd have a close-up of his eyes in a photograph. So there are certain liberties that I do take in constructing the collages. Probably the most frequent question that is asked of me is, well, do you feel that these explorers were more heroic, they were braver, they took bigger chances than astronauts do? And invariably, I think about it and I come up with an answer, a very definite yes on the side of the Arctic and Antarctic explorers. The reason being that before the astronauts go to the moon, everything is plotted out. They know where they're going. They've seen maps. They've seen photographs of the craters they might land on. These people were making the maps. They were going to nowhere. They didn't know whether they would ever be back. There was no global positioning. There was no radio communication. There was certainly no cell phones or any way to connect yourself back to the land you came from, or the city, or whatever, or your wives or sweethearts or relatives. And so you would go for maybe 3 years minimum, possibly 5 or 6 if it was bad luck. Maybe you would never come back. The only way they would ever know that something happened to you is if you didn't return. That's a kind of strange way of looking at it. But if you did return in a matter of years, you had a reputation and you had a tale to tell, but you were certainly, it seems to me, braver traveling to places which were unmapped and unknown. I'm showing you this because it's very interesting. A number of the explorers were also artists at the same time. Captain Cook's pilot was an artist who not only painted Captain Cook, but painted very romantic paintings of different parts of the voyage. This man, his name is Sir John Ross. He's a British explorer who lived in the 1800s. He captained 2 expeditions to the Arctic. He never went to the Antarctic. But he also, while he was a captain and while he was marooned in the ice, his artistic side came out, and he created paintings and drawings. A lot of the times they did drawings which were subsequently turned into etchings or engravings once they got back home. He also worked as a ghostwriter for this Lord Saumarez, who was second in command of Horatio Nelson's Battle of the Nile. They were close friends, and he did work on his memoirs. So you say, well, gee, it's great that they have talent. They can do this sort of thing, but why not take an artist along? The reason being, the entire thing boils down to space. These ships were packed. To go on a voyage of 3 years, you had to take a lot of supplies and presumably a fairly large crew. So if you could get somebody to do a job and to do another job at the same time, you get 2 people in one body. So this is why a lot of them either undertook it themselves or they learned how. But if you look into some of their work, it's quite interesting. This is an engraving landing on an iceberg in the Arctic. This is a first meeting with Inuit Indians in the Arctic. He was very skilled, and he was a very skilled artist, and he went twice to the Arctic. The second time he went, he was 75 years old, and he led an expedition. Here's another one, George Lyon. George Lyon not only went to Africa, but he went on a voyage. He was captain of a voyage to the Arctic, and he did these drawings. The picture in the middle of Lyon was a sketch that I did. One of the problems that you have in doing this kind of thing is you're reaching back in history. And these people were really damn busy. They couldn't sit down and have a portrait made. There was no photography. So there was nothing quick and easy. There was no video camera. So there was no easy way around it. And what the problem comes in for me is there's only one picture existing that I can work from of George Lyon. Captain Cook, the famous Captain Cook, there are only 3 paintings of him that exist. So you're working basically from another artist's point of view. I can't take Captain Cook and do a profile of him because I have no place to find the profile to work from. So it's an interesting sidelight, and I don't know if any of you are doing collages or whether you want to combine drawing with your collages, but my advice to you is do something that's accessible. This is an interesting one. The man's name is Inglefield, and he brought the first camera to the Arctic. The camera is what is known then as a wet plate. It was at the very beginning of photography, and the wet plate had to be coated. It was an emulsion that had to be coated on a piece of glass. Well, that's hard enough to do, but when you're doing that in sub-zero temperature, it freezes pretty quick. So he had to come around and figure out ways to do that. His pictures are interesting. From my point of view, coming from a background of fashion and beauty photography and advertising, it's interesting that the backgrounds are all white to isolate the figure. They're not taken against snow or ice. They're actually sails or pieces of canvas which have been dropped behind the subject matters. Much of the history of the Antarctic is anecdotal, so I'm going to end up by telling you a little story. This man, his name is Sir James Clark Ross. He is the nephew of Sir John Ross, the young nephew of Sir John Ross that I showed you over there, who did the drawings and the etchings while he captained the expeditions. James Clark Ross went with him when he was 15 years old. A lot of these explorers went to sea at a very early age, as early as 8 or 9 years old. If you see the movie Master and Commander, you'll see these very young boys working on ships of men of war or ships of exploration. It's a different race. It's a different breed of human beings. They are not like we are today. Can you imagine someone who is a mother letting their 9-year-old go on a ship to nowhere, uncharted waters? It just wouldn't happen. Well, he went when he was 15 years old with his uncle to the Arctic. James had no artistic ability, but he did see more ice than any other man living, because he not only went to the Arctic several times, but he spent 3 years in the Antarctic afterwards. when he came, he was a great one for naming things. There's Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf. Many, many places in the Arctic and the Antarctic named after him. He even named, he had a fiancée, and he even named many of Cape Ann. He named after her. And then he got into naming places after his upcoming father-in-law. So he was very much into that. Originally, I had done some work at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, University in England. And while I was there, they saw what I was doing and they offered me a show. The show went up, and there was a convention of cruise boats, cruise companies, cruise lines that went to the Antarctic. And one particular cruise line, they had constructed a ship, especially to go in the ice. And they asked me if I would want to have an exhibition on the ship. And I said, gee, that's terrific. They said, well, of course, we can't pay you. Forget it. But how would you like to go to the Antarctic free of charge? I said, I think we can put this one together. So I went on the ship. It was a very extensive tour. During the course of the tour, Abercrombie and Kent came to me and said, there's a picture that you've done, quite large, as large as any of the biggest ones here, of Sir James Clark Ross. We'd like to buy it. And the result was they bought it, and they bolted it because the rough weather and the sheet rocks a lot. They bolted it to the dining room wall. A year and a half ago on Thanksgiving Day, I don't know how many of you remember, but it was in the news, it was on television, etc. That ship struck an iceberg and sank. There were no lives lost, but my James Clark Ross now lies in about 1,000 fathoms of icy cold water. It's always been a very anecdotal kind of history, lots of stories, lots of ideas. A lot of people have said to me, gee, weren't you upset? Didn't that really bother you? No, there's a certain kind of poetry. It's like the first picture of Hollick Kenyon sitting on a bundle on a continent that's bigger than the United States and Mexico put together. Anybody have any questions?
I have a question about when you had said that 20, I don't remember what the date was, but they're going to open up these areas to drilling and, that they're going to open it up.
I didn't say that.
You didn't? Oh, the other guy. Yeah. But it's really frightening to think that, maybe we're going to lose all that. All the beauty and it's like the last pristine place on earth.
Very true. A lot of people ask me about that, as a separate thing. How do I feel about it? I feel very strongly about it. I feel very strongly that something should be done about it. And I wish we would start to get to do something. We're talking about it. First, we had to convince a whole lot of people that there was such a thing as global warming. We are, the technology of pollution is far outracing us. We're in the slow lane. We haven't really done anything about it. talk about it, make a lot of studies, but I think, you know, hopefully the new presidency will do something about it. But I think action has to be taken now because we're being outstripped.
Well, along those lines, I'd like to commend you for all your effort in bringing art and attention to exploration, the history of exploration. As an educator myself, I've studied a lot of this, and I think it is important to use art as a medium, and in this case to bring attention to global warming, and of course all the great risks these great explorers took. So, again, I commend you. I think this helps that process.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You cannot tell the history of the Arctic or the Antarctic without dealing with these guys, because they are the only history. They're the only people who went there. There, as I said before, there were Inuits who lived in the Arctic. Nobody lived in the Antarctic, and nobody was about to go there because there was no profit in it. Captain Cook, when he went there in the 1700s, wrote in his diary pretty much to the effect, this place is for the birds. No man will go further south than I have ever gone. And then later on in this diary, which was published and the world was eager to read about it, he mentions where all the whales are that he saw, and he mentions where all the seals are that he saw. And that was that. There were one American sealing company took 80,000 seals in one season. And this was in the 1800s. And it's been going on ever since. Anybody else? Yes?
With all of the historic things that you've captured, I'm really fascinated at how much time you must have spent researching all of these. And where do you find, in reading so many details that you don't normally hear in history, I think it's really neat, some of the little tidbits you put in there.
Well, yeah, as I said, a lot of it is anecdotal. A lot of it is cross-referential with the internet. There's a collage of an explorer over there named Constantine Phipps. I'd never heard of him. And I was looking up something else and it referred to Constantine Phipps. I said, I better look into this. And lo and behold, he was the first explorer to the Arctic who was not either looking for John Franklin or looking for a way to the Northwest Passage. So in a way, I mean, he had a certain importance. But it's done that way, the process itself, and the collages themselves. If you look at it without looking at the wall card, you look at something that is interesting, but you don't exactly put it together. When you look at it with the wall card, it makes much more sense. It's like a key.
Are there any plans to compile all of this into a book of any kind?
Yeah, that's a sort of a dicey question. A book has been published and printed by Xerox Corporation. Unfortunately, it's not for sale. The reason that it's not for sale is that each collage contains so many other little pictures and bits of information, and to get copyright clearance for all of them is horrendous. Some of them are copyright free, but you still have to prove that they're copyright free. So this takes an enormous amount of legal energy and money. Sorry. I would have loved to sold you a book. Anybody else? Well, again, I thank you. I'm very